all the year round.
Yay!
Yes, this is actually like the original inspiration for all the year round.
Yeah. So last year we did a talk at the University of Leicester about Christmas in Victorian periodicals, and it was after that we had a conversation to say that was so much fun. Like if only we could do this for other seasonal times, and that was the birth of all the year round.
And then we did.
Yeah.
Woohoo!
So it's kind of come full circle now.
It definitely has.
Not for the first episode of all the year round. That will be coming soon.
Yeah, we've really like dangled Dickens. Dickens is like in our very little first introductory episode. We're like, this is the inspiration. So people had to wait like a full 9, 10 months? 11 months? Is it 11? Maybe 11 months you've been waiting for us to talk about Dickens. But
yeah.
Here we are, we've got some potpourri, we've got our Christmas mugs, we have mince pies, we have, now apologies to any German speakers in our audience, I'm going to try really hard. Lebkuchen. Yes, please. They're little stars. They're
delicious.
Oh, you had one?
Yeah.
I wasn't paying attention. You must have really gone for that one. Yeah, they're little. It's strange because like it's difficult to. They're little cakes. They're little like gingerbready cakes dipped in icing sugar with like dark chocolate on the bottom. So we're big fans. So we're properly set up for a proper Christmas episode. We hope that you are too, nice and cosy, ideally with some kind of cup of tea, hot chocolate, that kind of situation.
Yes, yeah. Feeling festive, talk about Victorian Christmas, especially in Victorian periodicals.
We are, so going back to the origins of all the year round, we kind of did that because it paralleled periodicals in the sense of, they were weekly, it could be monthly, it could be quarterly, and through that you can kind of see like the changing of the seasons.
Yeah.
Yeah. There were special Christmas numbers, really famously all the year round, but also with a number of other magazines. So other magazines sometimes focus, particularly women's magazines, on like fashion or like changes in nature, which we touched on a little bit with the summer episodes where you were talking about the beach, fun activities you could do on the beach.
Yeah, so because these were, as you just said, they're coming out every month, you could then change the content for that season. And some of them were literally a separate thing, like a separate small magazine that was like in addition. If you imagine kind of, we still get them in
those
newspapers.
Are like overleaf ones that like slip out when you open them.
Oh, an extra magazine! Yeah, kind of like that. In fact, we've got one. Which we're going to be talking about more later.
Oh, yes.
But, yeah, this is the extra Christmas number for all the year round. This is actually the last one. You can see how small it was. It wasn't like particularly huge.
Oh, it is very slight.
Yeah, so this one was just one story essentially in parts, but we'll be talking about that later. So I'm not going to spoil that yet. That can stay there.
So all the year round, our namesake, was even fancier than most. So whilst others had tiny little overleafs, all the year round did a double issue at Christmas for double the price. Really packed it in.
Yeah, which I feel is kind of fitting because even now I think when people think of Victorian Christmas, they do think of Dickens, especially because of A Christmas Carol. And it just, it does fit. So it feels appropriate.
It does. The man loved a spooky theme. He was so into it.
Loved a spooky Christmas. Yeah.
Yeah, which, we respect.
Yes.
It brings that Victober vibe right into Christmas.
Absolutely. We can just extend it through spooky season right into festive season. Not that it was just Dickens, because ghost stories were just a Victorian Christmas tradition.
Yeah, so the very first Christmas number of all the year round, not the very first Christmas number he ever did, but the first one of all the year round was The Haunted House. And the whole premise of that was that it was going to be a ghost story collection of a lot of intersected ghost stories. So he got a lot of writers to get involved with that.
Yeah, so lots of ghost stories. Festive ghost stories.
Festive ghost
not
stories.
Just by Dickens.
Yes, not just by Dickens.
Yeah, so there's a lot of sort of speculation about how Victorians invented Christmas or Dickens invented Christmas, and that kind of like hyperbolic statement, which obviously we know isn't entirely true. And the sort of ghost storytelling, these short ghost stories, was a lot older. There's a book by Dewey Evans where he talks about the fact that this was like way back into the 15th century, I think, the tradition of telling short spooky stories around the festive season, which makes sense, and you can definitely see that. But it's sort of less obvious because they were mainly just like it's an oral tradition, so there's less of a record of it, which is why it feels a lot more sort of like this is visible Victorian tradition.
Yeah, oral history is so difficult to track.
Yeah, and there is something that is special about Dickens and the Victorian ghost story, and there's a brilliant article by Dr. Claire Wood, Charles Dickens and the Ghost Story, where she points out that Dickens, even though he wasn't the kind of the original one that made the Christmas ghost story, he was kind of central to the development of that ghost story because of the way he helped to shape public taste in that way. So even though it wasn't like the invention of a thing because it existed before, it's kind of
he was adding to
developing into something that we recognise more now as being like the Victorian ghost Christmas story.
Yeah, so he wasn't just on brand, he was like creating the brand.
Yes. Yeah. Redeveloping the brand. Yeah. And obviously we do. Like as we said at the beginning, we kind of associate like Victorian Christmas with Dickens and Christmas Carol and Christmas ghosts. Yeah. So very much a big Christmas thing. Yeah, which I really like. Love Christmas Carol. So obviously with that whole supernatural element to the ghost stories as well, that's something that Dickens was into in general. He was very into the supernatural. I think we have mentioned this on previous episodes. If listeners have seen our October Halloween episode, then they might remember us talking about how science and the supernatural wasn't quite this clear cut as we think of it now in Victorian times. And Dickens was interested in the research that was happening around the supernatural, which was taken seriously and was sort of mixing the scientific and supernatural.
And dreams are really important in Dickens as well.
Yeah, definitely. Dreams in Dickens might be something that we come to at a later time because that's more complicated.
So complicated.
Just the supernatural science. But yeah, so aside from A Christmas Carol, which is obviously just like the one that pops into everybody's heads, also for those who are really into Dickens, you'll know that there are lots of other Christmas ghost stories as well that he did. Lots of references to the supernatural. So you mentioned that first Christmas number that came out with a collection of ghost stories, and the first ghost story in that was The Mortals in the House. And in The Mortals in the House, the narrator meets a rapper, as it puts it, in the story.
Modern adaptation ideas are coming to mind. They're flowing, people.
Yeah, as a modern audience might look a bit weird, but actually if you were a contemporary reader, you would have recognised that as being a spirit rapper. So I don't know if you know what spirit rapping was.
No, please explain.
So this was kind of the seance idea, if anybody's ever seen a seance, where you would go to this like it was an event, and the person controlling the seance would get the spirits to do things like rap on the table, which is why it's called spirit rapping. You might also do things like something like float, or maybe like you get a ghostly hand touch you on the shoulder and things like that. And obviously
there was a whole session about ectoplasm and slime, and I was like, no.
I think I went to that.
Actually, I think that's one of the first things we ever did together, and I was just sat there like, this is so gross. I was like, I hate this.
Yeah, I kind of love it, to be honest.
It was one of those emotions where I was like, I'm enjoying this, but this is also so upsetting.
Yeah, it is. But brilliant. So yeah, you've got spirit rappers, and like we said, there were people who are really into this, who believed it. There are people who are researching this and kind of interested in what sort of forces might actually be at play to make this happen. And then of course you did also have skeptical people who would make fun of the seances and the spirit rappers and thought that it was all nonsense and it was all just strings and
silliness.
And white, yeah. But Dickens was interested in it. So in the first story of the Christmas number of All Year Round, we do see a spirit wrapper. And all of this kind of debate about seances and spirit wrapping and things like that, they were all happening in periodicals as well. So there was stuff about it in All the Year Round, in what Dickens was editing. There was stuff about it in the Cornhill magazine. Quite famously, there was a really good article about that and spiritualism, which was connected to it. But again, maybe we'll get to that a different time in the Cornhill magazine. But all of that stuff wasn't seasonal. It was just this like big, long-standing debate that was happening. It wasn't necessarily festive. But it is in this case. It becomes Christmassy.
Yeah, Dickens made it seasonal.
Yeah.
Yeah, so he essentially, the entire premise is based around Christmas. Everybody's going to stay there over the Christmas period, and then they're basically going to discuss the ghost stories amongst themselves on the 6th of January, 12th night. So the reason why this is so Christmassy and such a prolonged and terrifying ghost situation, if you think about it, is because Christmas traditionally goes on for a month. It's like 6th of December to 6th of January.
Yeah.
So that's a lot of time that you're opening yourself up to like ghost interactions. You'd have to have a ghost journal, I think, in this situation.
And it's kind of what happens, isn't it, in the story, with everybody's various stories of the supernatural within the house.
Yeah, it's very like almost like Mary Shelley, of just being like, none of us can go outside, so let's all just sit around and write ghost stories.
Yeah.
Like it would like open yourself up to that. But yeah, so the first one, very, very Christmassy, but I think as we go through, things get less Christmassy with the Christmas number. So like in No Thoroughfare, which you have a copy of, which is incredible.
Yeah, that's what we were talking about here at the beginning. If you're watching on the video version. If not, then you can see this on our social media.
Haley has a very delicate copy of it.
Yeah.
Oh, it's beautiful. Oh, it's so blue. Why is it still so blue?
It's so blue. I mean, one of the reasons that I particularly love this is a lot of the time when you see these, it doesn't have the blue bit. It's just the side. So if, again, if you're watching this, if you open up the front page, there's sort of another front page inside that also has No Thoroughfare, All the Year Round, Christmas number on it. But the blue wrapper part has advertisement
which
printed on the inside,
so
which we'll also come back to
later. But the very plot of No Thoroughfare, so Dickens and Wilkie Collins wrote it together, as I understand it. Yeah, so as you were saying before, it's a really short story. It's not that Christmassy. There's sort of like betrayal and like forbidden love amongst different classes.
Yeah.
So it's not like explicitly Christmassy, but it's Christmassy in the sense of everything's sort of about like good overcoming evil.
Yeah.
And that's kind of like a common theme that we see in like Christmas pantos and things like that.
Yeah, so you kind of got like all the social drama of Dickens and Wilkie Collins, both of which I love, but then with a bit of like extra Christmas joy interjected into that. And yeah, exactly as you said, good over evil.
Yeah.
Which we see in all of the supernatural Christmas stories as well.
Of course. Yeah, I mean, it became so immensely popular that I believe it was, in January of 1864, he actually wrote to Wilkie Collins saying that the last Christmas number that he published in 1863 had done so immensely well that it had sold 220,000 copies. That's so many copies.
Yeah.
It gives you hope that you'll be able to dig one out. There's that many of them, technically, that were like printed in the world.
Yeah. Taken care of, I guess, is the problem.
Yeah.
Because they are, like, again, if you're looking at this on the video, or if you can see the picture on social media, they would have been easy to damage or lose because...
Slap a couple of tea over it, accidentally shove it in the fire. There's so many things that can happen to a periodical over that kind of time period. But so that's sort of like your realm. But what I originally researched was basically women-oriented magazines. And many of them did have literary endeavours, but what I found interesting was the fact that it was not as explicitly Christmassy as Dickens. Ironically, one of the key themes was death. So much death, so much Christmas death You know, as we were talking about earlier with like the nature aspect, so many things have like nature coming to an end, but some of them are just like, here's a story about children dying in winter, but actually it's fine because they're angels, and like snow is so pure, and angelic souls. I'm like, that is a very nice way to look at a very grim time of year.
Yeah, and you know, I think it does feel particularly sort of fitting because, again, if you've watched or listened to some of our earlier episodes when we've talked about the women's periodicals, especially the Ladies' Treasury, you do get quite a lot of seasonal stuff in there. So there's kind of like, you know, we're now moving into the spring, and so this is what to expect, and a lot more sort of like nature-based things. So, of course, with winter being traditionally in the circle of the year, the time of death. Yeah, and I suppose I've never really thought about this before, but in a more practical way, there probably was an increase in death during the winter with various like illnesses and.
Yeah, the Ladies' Treasury continues with its conservative sort of run, because even in its fashion plates, it's like, you might want to go to a Christmas party or a New Year's Eve party and have a lovely time, but you shouldn't wear anything light and pretty. You should wear something knitted and something up to your neck. Yeah. No decolletage for you.
Yeah, so we did. We had a very much more kind of like practicality in the Ladies' Treasury in comparison to some of the other women's periodicals.
Even their adverts were boring. Or their original adverts were a bit boring.
Yeah.
They were mostly just like, buy bound copies of everything we said to you this year.
Yeah.
Or like, basically, they pretty much, for a number of years, and friends, I did, this was a big research project that we did, so I looked through like decades of this. The only other thing they advertised in that time was basically other books on household management that they were already serializing in their own serial. I was like, that interesting choices were made.
Yeah, this is very kind of like minimized frivolity, isn't it? Like, yeah, you might have to go to some social occasions that are technically parties, but even then, you should be very practical about it.
Be very practical. Maybe give the hostess a bound copy of all of our thoughts on how to be a better host.
Yeah, the perfect gift.
Oh my God, can you imagine? Speaking of the perfect gift, in the latter half of the century, then the luxury was hitting. The gifting, the commercialisation of Christmas, as we always refer to it. Oh, it was in full force. So there are a few adverts that I loved and that we're going to include in the video. I'm going to put some of them up on the social media as well, because they are all out of copyright, which is also exciting. Yeah. So first and foremost was the photographic album, which was not just, as you might imagine, like a nice little album where you put all your pictures. It was had like a beautiful cover on it with a lovely little painted image, but in the bottom of it, it also had a stored music box. So when you opened it and you were able to flick through all your pictures, you'd also be able to have like this music playing in the background. It's very multimedia.
It is. I love that. When you first told me about that last year, I think the sort of example that came to mind for us was it's a bit like when your phone gives you like memories now. If you've got a smartphone and it plays music in the background as you're looking through the pictures.
Yeah.
So yeah, that would have been a really impressive Christmas gift.
Sorry, my brain went to what would a Victorian Spotify Wrapped look like?
Yeah.
Just be audiobooks. Audiobooks of like the oral tradition of people like taking stories of like.
That'd be great, actually.
Yeah, love that for them. So beyond that, we also had perfume lamps, which are basically just modern day diffusers to scent rooms.
Yeah.
Beautiful, lovely. Okay, brace yourself. The third one that I saw that I found most interesting were dinner table fountains. So the tiny little fountains of water that you use to replace little bowls. So you originally had little, so particularly if you're like eating with your hands, you have little bowls to sort of like dip your fingers in and clean them before you eat other things with your hands. Now, the wholesome part of my brain thinks of, I don't know if you remember this, because we're going back unfortunately, 2 decades ago, I looked up the date to Shrek 2. I don't know if you remember.
That's scary.
I know.
Too much
So upsetting. I don't know if you ever watched it.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, do you remember when Shrek goes to the castle and they're all sitting around for dinner, and at one point they're having meals, they have this, like, I think that they have escargot and Shrek eats it wrong and but anyway, they're sat there and so Shrek begins to like slurp this and he goes, oh, this is really good soup, and Fiona's like, no, and then you turn around and everybody's like, washing their fingers. Now I try to think of that, I try very hard to think of that, because the only alternative is to remember an article that I read during my PhD. It's very upsetting, so again, brace yourself. Because they did not change the water, so they just became little petri dishes of bacteria, because you're washing your fingers in the same thing between courses without ever changing the water.
Oh dear.
Disgusting. So maybe the table fountain. Well, I was going to say, this is the thing, is that what I would really like is to actually see one, because it's recycling the same water.
I would imagine. Probably, yeah.
I mean, because that's potentially even worse of bacteria, because then we're getting to all the little parts that like spout out the water. So maybe
not the best Christmas gift. But I think one of the things that I liked about all of these as well is you can really tell that sort of like mechanical, industrial element coming into it, which of course is really what changed, because earlier in the century you still had Christmas gifts, but they were like maybe some fruit, some nuts, that kind of thing. If you did have gifts for children, they had to be handmade, so they're obviously time intensive and therefore really expensive as well. But yeah, as you get later in, you've got more cool stuff, more gadgets almost.
Gadgets, gadgets. Top 10 Victorian gadgets.
Yeah.
That's something we should think about in the future.
Yeah.
But moving on
soon.
Yes. But moving on to party games, just for the time being. Let me tell you, friends, there were a number of them. Some of them so tedious, I thought I would rather stare into a fire.
That would also have been a Victorian option.
I know. I was being very on brand. Yeah. So I decided to go for some specific ones. There was one that was designed for a party of over 40 people. I don't know who's hosting this party. That's a lot of food.
Yeah.
That's a lot of activity. That's too
much.
much.
A lot of friends.
That's too tiring. I'd be so tired. Anyway, the idea was that you had these blank cards, and basically everyone would write a name on them and place them on their way out of the room. When everybody was out of the room, the hostess would reshuffle them, put them back down, and then when you file back in the room, you pick up a card, and whatever's on the card is your new name. And the idea was that you would write down silly names. But what's really odd is the thing that seems to have caused the most amount of amusement to the Victorians was the gender bending element. So you had like women who had men's names and men who had women's names. So you had like reintroduce yourself to people with your fun name, or ask people to dance with your fun name. And if you failed to like react or reply to somebody who called your fun name and not your actual name, like you'd have to perform forfeits.
Oh, no.
And I was like, oh my god, that's a bit confusing. So Ladies' Treasury was very specific here, and they said that you should actually take very great care of this game so that the execution does not lead to a romp.
You wouldn't want to romp.
No romping at Christmas. No, you can't be dealing with all of that. Oh god, this is one of the boring. I mean, it's again, no offense, but this is what I titled Victorian Countdown. Okay, so this was. You have a word in a group of you, and then you sit in silence for 10 minutes while you try to rearrange the word into as many different words as possible. But, and here's the other like added element that makes it slightly different, is even if the original word has a duplicate of letters, you can only use one.
Oh.
I don't know why.
It would take 10 minutes to be honest.
I don't think it would take 10 minutes.
Really
this is my countdown is like a minute, 30 seconds, like... That's why.
Yeah.
10 minutes. Oh.
Maybe we were expecting some punch up being drunk at this point.
God, I hope so. I want the punch, I want the wassail, maybe have a couple of gins. I need it all if we're going to do this. Speaking of alcohol involved with games, You may have heard of Snapdragon.
Oh yes, this is my favourite one.
This is my favourite one. It was also my favourite one when I did that section for BBC Leicester.
Yeah.
And I was like, there's this ridiculous game that you need to know when I did the Christmas section last year. So Snapdragon, we think that it originates around the 16th century. It's actually quoted in Shakespeare at one point. But it was really popular throughout the 18th century and into the Victorian era. And what you essentially did was you got a lot of brandy and you put all your raisins in the brandy so it soaked it all up, and then you set it alight. And the game was essentially just shove as many as you could in your mouth, and whoever ate the most won. And I assume whoever ate the most but also didn't sustain lifelong burns won.
Yeah. I think when I say this is my favourite, it's my favourite because it just seems like such a strange and unlikely thing to present to somebody as a game. Please stick your hands into this fire and then put it in your mouth.
Particularly like that aspect of like when you see some of the images, particularly around the 18th century, there's like children playing it.
Yeah.
I'm like, no, go and sit and do Victorian Countdown.
Yeah, I feel like Victorian Countdown is very the ladies' treasury, whereas Snapdragon would be more like the English Woman's Domestic Magazine, a little bit more risky.
A little bit more risque.
Yeah. But I guess so the fire should go out because it's just
theoretically it's still real hot though. I was thinking about that because I was like, even if it's technically not on fire, things can still be hot after it's been on fire.
It'd be interesting to know how many injuries were sustained as a result of
I know. It's actually ironic. You'd think that there'd maybe be something like minor burns in some of those magazines, just being like, hey, if you're being naughty and playing Snapdragon this Christmas, here are things that you can do. So, speaking of throats on fire, I did not find as many medical adverts as I thought that I would. It's not like today where, you know, when you open like a magazine around this time of year and it's like, have you tried Nurofen? Do you know about Lemsip? And it's like, I know about all these things. Thank you so much. So I found a recipe written in by a woman called Constance, and she was writing in to give you a recipe for what she titled Unbroken Chilblains. I've just realised we should probably describe what that means, but I don't really know I know what they are, like in a visceral sense, but I don't know how to describe it. It's just like
I don't really know how to describe it either. It just is when your feet get really cold and then warm up too quickly and the tips of your toes feel like bruised.
Yeah. It's very uncomfortable and there's like dry skin involved and it's just really sore and it can crack open. Again, sorry for the description, but I'm sure, to be fair, I'm sure listeners have it as well because it's very, very common.
Yeah, unless you're lucky enough to live in a warm country.
Yes, in which case I'm sure you have different issues. But yes, so Constance said that she had got some advice from Dr. H.H. Pardon, who was supposedly a physician to Hospital for Diseases of Skin in Belfast. Interesting that we're putting this in Ireland because it's just like, don't check, you don't need to check, that's very far away, there's no reason to check. What I'm telling is the truth. So her recipe called for balsam, which we have in tissues now. Fine, that sounds fine.
So far so good.
So far so good. The next was rectified spirits. Okay. Some disinfection properties that it's okay, it's just fine. Hydrochloric acid.
Okay.
Maybe no. Maybe let's not do that. And then she suggested that there was some gum to bind it.
Right. So we're going for soothing properties, but also acid.
Yeah, that was her 4-step process to getting rid of chilies by burning your feet off.
Yeah, I mean, technically you might get rid of them, and of course this is definitely a very real doctor.
Oh, very real doctor, very real doctor. No need to check. Yeah. No need to check. I just realised that this leads us on to our very last point.
Mm-hmm.
It's product placement time.
Oh, okay, yeah, but that is an interesting one. So I did say earlier that we would come back to the wrapper of All Year Round, the blue cover that's on there. So yeah, this because it was the Christmas episode, essentially, it was a Christmas instalment All Year Round. It always had advertisements in it. That's not specifically for Christmas, but they do have slightly more specific Christmas advertisements. So,
or they at least seem like seasonally pertinent.
Yeah, so this one has just one, I think, that specifically refers to Christmas, which is some books. So this is, if I read it out, 50,000 juvenile gift books, Bibles, prayer books, and standard illustrated works for Christmas presents at Field's Great Book and Bible Warehouse, which was on 65 and 67 Regent Street, next to St James's Hall, and you get some examples underneath of the kind of things you can buy from them.
I took this a slight step further because I was like, no, we can dig in. So there's also Keating's cough lozenges. Try saying that 10 times fast. There's also Powell's Balsam of Aniseed, which is also for coughs, colds, and asthma, which I think is actually very, at least seasonally related. I'm sure it's sold all year round because, everyone gets coughs, colds, and asthma.
Yeah, but as you said, even now, we definitely get a lot more advertisements for kind of cough sweets, cough medicine.
Yeah.
Things like that. You do expect your chest to be more affected by the weather. And if we're back in Victorian times, of course, especially in London, your chest might also be affected by
I wouldn't make it, Hayley. I wouldn't make it through. But we're going to end on a little happy one, which I really like, which I still think is seasonal. It's Epps Cocoa.
Yeah, cocoa advertisements, definitely Christmassy, isn't it?
Oh, it's gorgeous. Oh, available at the Strand and Oxford Street. Oh, fancy.
It does all sound very fancy. We also have things in here for pickles and stuff like that.
There's easy chairs, sofas and ottomans, which again you could almost stretch to being Christmassy because it's like, are you having a gathering of 40 plus people?
Yeah.
Do you need extra seating?
Around the fire, perhaps. And fancy pens with Joseph Gillett's celebrated steel pens.
Oh, that is the Victorian equivalent of socks, isn't it?
Maybe. It says it's sold by all dealers throughout the world, which sounds unlikely, but...
I love that all these adverts, as I was reading them and trying to condense them down, just said, they're sold at all retailers, sold at all chemists, they're sold everywhere.
You can definitely get this
everywhere. Definitely, 100%.
But yeah, it is... it's funny to see the similarity.
Yeah.
Between the kind of advertisements we get now and the advertisements that they had in here, even though of course there are some differences. And as you said with the medical example of chilblain cream, not
don't do it to yourself.
That creates fantastic advertisements. But
if you want to see those advertisements, we're going to be putting them up on our Twitter and on our Instagram, so you get to have a good little poke and see some authentic Victorian advertisements. Speaking of authentic Victorian advertisements, we move back to women-oriented magazines with our final product placement. So, in those, they had substantial narratives. They weren't just straight out plasterboard aspects of, here it is, buy it.
Yeah, they like a little advertisement. Here's the title, what it's called.
Here's the title. Get it everywhere. Yeah. Fixes everything.
Yeah.
This is the thing that will make your life 100% better.
Which is more like what the rappers did.
Yeah, exactly.
The advertisements in some of, at least, the English woman.
I scoured, Hayley. I really scoured hard for this. So a few of the advertisements, and you got them periodically, was essentially advertisers. And some of the advertisements are long. They're really long. Some of them are 5 big pages of tiny writing mostly about toys, actually. Mostly about going into the shopping centre to find toys for children, mechanical wonders, gadgets that could all kind of be found under the same roof, usually in Regent Street or Oxford Street. And it was essentially part story, part most verbose advert you've ever seen in your life.
Yeah. So it's funny because it does sort of look hidden. So you can't, if you look at the inside of the periodical that's got, if you're not used to seeing them, sort of just the stories, poems, articles, one after the other, in usually 2 columns of writing. And when you see those advertisements in the Englishman's Domestic magazine, you wouldn't immediately see that it was an advertisement until you've kind of got maybe a quarter of the way through, and then you realise that they're making a lot of references to this specific store.
It's like, do you remember when YouTubers didn't have to put that they had to add, and it wasn't until they got like a few sentences in that you were like, oh, excuse me, you're trying to sell me something.
Yeah, this is Victorian product placement.
This is Victorian product placement. The most brazen one, which I loved, and you loved last year as well, was the doll.
Yeah.
The doll. So, in the 1865 version of the Englishman's Domestic magazine, they had this article, but they also had on the front page a picture of this little doll that you could purchase. And they described it in rich detail about how the eyes had been brought in from a specialist who had created them, and it had the finest hair that could be bought, and it was made beautifully of wax. There was a terrifying section in there that was like, please don't leave it too close to the fire because it will melt.
Yeah.
And I had images of an absolutely terrifying Victorian doll that would be given to a child to be like, oh my god, this was so expensive and you ruined it, but you have to love it because it was so expensive. But we digress. So the writer of this little article said, obviously, because this was incredibly expensive, it was so expensive it didn't even tell us how much it was in the article. So I cannot speak to how expensive it was, but I feel like it's in the arena of, if you have to ask, it's too expensive for you.
It did give that impression.
That's the vibe. So the writer says, the picture itself makes a very pretty present, and if cut out and pasted on cardboard, makes a very pretty toy for itself. So, my friends, we can't do it in person, obviously, because we are just voices in your ear or images in your eyes. But what we have done is we've taken that little periodical image and we've put it down in the description. So if you want to follow that link, have a little look at the doll. If the doll pleases you, that's a key component, and you're like, I would like to have a Victorian toy this Christmas, you can print it off, cut it out, slap it on some cardboard, and have your own little Victorian toy this Christmas.
Yeah. So that's our Christmas present to you. Now, we did actually have somewhat of a debate when we originally presented the doll. Some people thought that it was really cute and brilliant. Some people thought it was terrifying.
Yeah.
So depending on which category you fall into, you may not want the Victorian doll in your house.
Honestly, we had, our friend Jackie, who was on the podcast back in April, who talked about Charlotte Bronte and fairies. We had a lovely time with her. Like, she loved it so much, she wanted to make a garland of them, but somebody else who I gave it to was like, oh, and I was like, do you not like it? I can take it back. And they're like, no, I'll keep it. And I was like, okay, all right, yeah.
But maybe turn it to face the other way.
Yeah, that's fine too.
Which kind of brings us back in a nicely cyclical way to spooky Christmas.
Spooky Christmas.
So, if you do find the doll particularly spooky, then that doesn't necessarily mean you can't use it as a Christmas decoration, because you are still being very Victorian with your combination of terrifying, supernatural, Christmas things.
It's the most sustainable gift I'll find, because it also means that next year you can start whacking it out about Halloween. I mean, that gift lasts you like 3 months out of the year.
Yeah. So we hope you will have a very lovely Christmas with maybe some Victorian traditions in it.
Yeah, and only like little light bits that enjoyably spooky for you. Nothing bad spooky, only good spooky.
Yes. Just like the ghostly stories. Always ends up in a cheerful and good place.
Aside from if it's usually Gaskell, in which case no.
Yeah. Good point. Not for everyone.
But we hope that you have a wonderful Christmas. We hope that you enjoyed our Christmas episode as we delved into Christmas periodicals.
Yes. We will see you in the new year.
We will see you in January. It's another Emma episode.
Yes.
Yeah.
And when we will nearly have gone entirely all the year round with this series.
Can you believe it? Doesn't it feel like we did this just yesterday?
Yeah, it really does.
It really does.
It's fun.